Few movie franchises are as rich with storytelling possibilities beyond their mainline drama as Star Wars. There are other characters, events, and genres that are practically begging to be explored within this grand backdrop, and there were plenty of books, comics, video games, and even films and television shows before the 2010s doing exactly that. To a large portion of fans, characters like Mara Jade, Revan, Kyle Katarn, Delta Squad, and Starkiller are just as interesting and beloved as any from the mainline films, perhaps even more so. Disney was keenly aware of this when they bought Lucasfilm in 2012, and that George Lucas himself was always open to telling other kinds of stories beyond the episodes. So selecting what the first big-budget live-action film set apart from the Skywalker saga would focus on was an exciting but tricky prospect. As with The Force Awakens, a lot rode on this film's success, not the least of which was Lucasfilm's future plans for expansion into a unified and consistent multimedia experience for audiences. At first, the effort was going towards a Han Solo standalone film, as following a well-established and respected character would be a fine way to guide audiences into the vast unknown for Star Wars stories. However, progress was delayed on that film when its lead writer, Lawrence Kasdan, was transferred over to help with Episode 7. In the meantime, John Knoll, a veteran employee of ILM, had an idea brewing in the back of his mind since 2003 about dramatizing the heist for the plans to the Death Star mentioned during the opening crawl to the original film. This was initially for the Underworld TV series Lucas had planned to do after Episode 3's release, but when that project stalled and Disney bought Lucasfilm, Knoll pitched the idea again to Kathleen Kennedy, and she responded enthusiastically. Gareth Edwards, hot off his success with Godzilla, was signed on as director, with Gary Whitta serving as the initial writer. Because of the delay with Solo, the new film entitled Rogue One was pushed through to take its place. Numerous writers, both credited and uncredited, would contribute to the script, including Chris Weitz, Christopher McQuarrie, Scott C. Burns, Michael Arndt, and Tony Gilroy. Principal photography went fine, but numerous concerns were raised, particularly regarding the finale. While reshoots are normal for any big-budget film, Rogue One's was a bit more intensive. Tony Gilroy was brought on to write additional scenes, enough to be given official credit, and to help oversee the reshoots with Edwards. It's hard to know how much was changed, who did exactly what, and how much goodwill there was on set, given conflicting reports, both contemporary and retrospective. However, looking at the three major theatrical trailers gives us quite a bit of insight, since a lot of the shots and voiceover lines do not appear in the final film, or are modified enough to be incongruent. Regardless of production hurdles, Rogue One was released on December 16, 2016, almost a full year after The Force Awakens. Reviews were pretty positive at the time, suggesting the gamble had paid off, and the future was bright for the franchise. In the years following, given the large backlash to both the sequel trilogy and most of the recent Disney Plus shows, Rogue One seems to have weathered the debate well, with many calling it their favorite of the films since Episode 3, and with the addition of a critically acclaimed prequel TV show, it has achieved an almost hallowed status amongst the divided fanbase. In the years following the destruction of the Jedi Knights and the death of the Old Republic, the Empire has risen to be the dominant oppressive force in the galaxy and continues to grow beyond measure. Jyn Erso, a reluctant weapons scientist in hiding, is found and forced to work on a new superweapon that can destroy planets. His daughter, Jyn Erso, evades the Empire's troops and is picked up by Saw Gerrera. 15 years later, the Rebel Alliance finds her and offers to secure her freedom if she will lead them to Saw, who possesses a message from Galen confirming the existence of this Death Star. Accompanied by Cassian Andor and his droid K2SO, Jyn travels to the Imperial mining world of Jedha, where the Empire looks for kyber crystals to power the weapon. Soon, they not only witness the new weapon's destructive power firsthand, but discover that Galen has placed a weakness inside the station which will destroy it. However, the architectural plans they need are locked away in the data vault on Scarif, one of the most heavily guarded Imperial installations in the galaxy. Faced with almost certain defeat, Jyn and Cassian lead a band of rebels to make the attempt to steal the plans powered on little but faith and trust in the Force. Rogue One is a puzzling movie to me. The first two-thirds feel compromised in its story, characters, and pacing, to the point where I'm bored and at points lost. Yet the payoff is incredible and well worth the wait. The film flies in the face of what I thought were pretty set standards for myself when judging films. On paper, it's a very average flick that has glaring issues. However, the final act is so engaging and thrilling that it wins me back over. I've seen plenty of movies that have lackluster third acts that threaten to ruin the whole experience, but I can't say I've seen many examples of the opposite. And I feel odd giving the movie points I don't feel like the piece as a whole earns. That's not to say there isn't a lot to like about the film apart from the finale. The movie works hard to deliver a thematically rich treatise on hope and the power of belief. It has a feeling that's quite different from any other film in the series so far. It's the first one to really feel like a war movie. And I don't just mean that because it focuses on ground and air battles with multiple combatants. It has some pretty poignant writing at times. It's got a good sense of levity to contrast with the grimness of the story. And believe it or not, it enhances the original film rather than detracts from it, to the point of retroactively making Episode 4 an even better film than it already was. That being said, the pacing is atrocious. Most of the characters are quite bland and one-dimensional. There's an abundance of fan service moments and characters that draw attention to themselves at the expense of the film's story, and the thematic foundation is threatened by a less than convincing character arc for Jyn. It's a compromise film to be sure, but in spite of the odd math, I still find myself recommending it, although it's not one I tend to go back to that much, even amongst the more recent films. The film has a solid thematic underpinning to its tale. Hope is a word I think has been overused in the Star Wars series and other projects, but it serves as the central pillar here well, particularly since the movie shows how an active belief in a cause naturally leads to developing hope for the future and within others. Jyn Erso, for example, starts the film being a rebel without a cause, believing the galaxy has taken more from her than it has given. When she is shown that her father has sacrificed his life just for the chance of defeating the oppressors, her eyes are open, and her father becomes even more magnified as a hero despite not being a visible part of the rebellion. By the small and simple acts of ordinary people are greater events brought to pass. You may not be the one rewarded by an audience or the light of gratitude, but in the grand arithmetic of history, you matter. Jyn then follows in her father's footsteps, both to validate his actions and to provide the rebellion with the hope it needs to start to truly push back against the Empire. There are other examples of this optimism, particularly with Cassian's development in valuing each human life beyond the individual moment and the immediate benefit, Bodhi's defection to the rebellion allowing for him to make things right, and the rebellion following the example of Jyn in exercising faith by launching a quick but costly raid on Scarif. All this serves as a meta-commentary about the film and its place within the larger story. Rogue One's faith that there will be a future paves the way for the titular New Hope of Episode 4. That hope isn't just the singular hero Luke Skywalker coming forth, it's about what Luke, Han, and Leia represent, building on top of Rogue One's characters' actions and how they galvanize the galaxy to fight back against evil. Episode 4 still carries its story importance, but Rogue One plays the supporting role necessary to lay the foundation upon which the rest of the Skywalker saga will build and then go on to finish the fight with the Sith. To echo the words of Luthen Rael in Andor, Rogue One burns its life to make a sunrise it knows it will never see. All of this sounds fine and dandy, and it would work beautifully for me if I fully bought Jyn's transformation from rebel to soldier. The arc is there, but what I'm fuzzy on is the actual progression and speed of it. It feels a little easy. Remember that Jyn is in the first act arguing with Saw that the rebels have brought her nothing but pain, and that the oppression of the Empire isn't a problem if you don't look up. This seems to be the core of Jyn's life for the last few years. Live free, don't join, to quote DJ in The Last Jedi. However, she seems to experience a light switch moment upon seeing her father again, and then later as her father dies that convinces her that this cause is not only important, but that she should give her life for it. Despite her still harboring problems with the Rebel Alliance and even accusing Cassian of being no better than a stormtrooper, she goes on to make a heartfelt plea about going after the plans even if it will probably fail because rebellions are built on hope. The way this plays to me, it makes it seem like her motivations are more about living up to her father's example than actually caring for the cause herself, which takes away some of the power of her words and example. And the progression goes from one extreme to the other with such speed that my neck hurts from the whiplash. I get that movies are on a time crunch and that these things can't play out as slowly as they would in real life, but Jyn rarely has a moment of downtime to talk to anybody about where she sits on the progression scale. Most of her scenes are either in the thick of the action, giving exposition, or grandstanding morality monologues. This leads me to not fully understanding why she makes the shift because I'm not getting into her head enough. I have the previously mentioned vague notion, but if it is primarily about her living up to her father's example, I'm wondering if the movie is being dishonest about her commitment to the cause. Maybe I'm missing something, but I'm not convinced someone would go from sit on the sidelines to dying on a suicide mission just because of an act her father makes. In this sense, Jyn doesn't feel like a three-dimensional character, but rather a mouthpiece for the movie's themes to play their melody, and that quite frankly sucks. Most of the characters in the film are underbaked due to the story's focus and pacing, which I'll touch on later. But it's a shame that the protagonist isn't spared this same fate, given that her broader story progression fits right at home with the themes of the Skywalker saga. Part of my hesitation to embrace this movie fully is its cast of characters. They feel too numerous, and some are purely there to get us from point A to point B. When I walked out of the theater for the first time, you could have held a blaster to my head, and I couldn't have told you most of the names of the characters despite having just spent 2 hours with them. It wasn't so much that I knew that they were going to die, and thus I resisted bonding with them, it's just that each felt like pawns in the story. Chirrut and Baze Malbus in particular feel like extra muscle for the mission, and I'm not sure the final act really needed them or their unique skill sets to be completed. You could have replaced Chirrut with Melshi hitting the master switch and the mission wouldn't have gone any differently. Sure, they are nice to have, and Chirrut has the added benefit of being the most lighthearted of the human characters, but I'm not convinced their roles couldn't have been served just as well with other existing characters. Bodhi is a little better, given his inside knowledge of the Empire. But given that Cassian is a longtime soldier for the Rebellion and has likely come up against the Empire quite a few times, and as we'll find out on this show, has knowledge of the Imperial bases, is a pretty decent pilot, and is comfortable with infiltration into heavily guarded installations, I couldn't see a compelling reason not to morph him and Bodhi into one person, beyond the early plot point of an Imperial defector bringing in Galen's message to Saw, thus being a second confirmation about the Death Star's existence, which I'm not convinced we needed to see play out on screen. Jyn Erso provides most of the comic relief here, and has a few awesome combat moments, but he serves as more of a plot function character than an integral component of the story. At this point, I should mention what I feel is the distinction between plot and story. A plot is a through line of events. You are hungry, you choose to make a sandwich, you make the sandwich, and then eat it. A story is the larger context of these events, the themes inherent in the progression of the plot, and how each character contributes meaningfully to both. You could argue that since K2 is a droid, he shouldn't expect it to be much more than a machine, and thus wanting him to feel like a real character is demanding too much. The problem is that R2 and 3PO were essential in the thematic makeup of the original trilogy and feel like distinct characters that were important to that story. As is, K2 essentially fulfills a similar role to Jar Jar Binks, the difference being in his competency and most of the humor landing. Briefly on Cassian, I initially found him to be as bland as the other characters, but upon re-examination, I found that I loved the idea of a soldier who sacrificed his decency for the rebellion and having lost a part of his humanity. He rediscovers that part through Jyn's eagerness and purity of spirit, thus making his death a very meaningful one. I never felt like the movie had enough time to delve fully into this idea because it was focusing on other priorities. Thankfully, we got that with the Andor show. As much as I would love to talk about that and how much it added to a franchise that sorely needed it, this is a review of the movie. Let me just say for now, that while that show adds some richness to the film and makes certain throwaway lines even more meaningful, it does not fix my core issues with the film, as this is Jyn's story, not Cassian's. That said, I liked Cassian enough that I was very pleased with the idea of him getting a prequel show, even if I wasn't clamoring for it. And oh boy, that turned out to be a seismic shift of an experience I wasn't expecting. The most interesting characters to me were Jyn Erso and Orson Krennic. Jyn Erso is played by Mads Mikkelsen, a veteran actor who regular viewers of this channel should be very familiar with, and he did not disappoint. The tale of a reluctant scientist who builds a superweapon against his will is a provocative one. While I knew the story couldn't focus on him for very long, Mikkelsen makes each scene count, and I felt a lot of sympathy right off the bat for him. Plus, there is the added complication that the man making him do this was once a trusted family friend, adding a personal layer to this whole affair. Orson Krennic is played masterfully by Ben Mendelsohn, an actor I've always liked. He's an ambitious officer with a chip on his shoulder. He may not have been the first to propose the idea of the Death Star, but he is arguably the one who has given the most to see it through to completion and is thoroughly committed to the ideas of the Empire. His rivalry with Tarkin is a great look into how unstable the Empire actually is behind its veneer of strength, and how the spark of hope for the rebellion is enough to put fear into the enemy. Authority is brittle, and tyranny requires constant effort. Krennic shows this through his actions to stamp out any fires that start up under his watch, and we see that it is a fragile shadow of real power, as there are always people above him who are just as committed to destroying his ambitions as any rebel. Even Vader warns him that his ambition will be the death of him, and it's not because of some vague notion that his ego will implode, it's because he has given his all in an environment that will not allow him to rise to the top of the pile. And in the end, he is destroyed by the very same unfeeling weapon he worked so hard to build. I was hoping this film wouldn't be the last we see of him, and thankfully he not only came back for the second season of Andor and a bit of the Bad Batch, but there is a book called Catalyst that is devoted to Galen and Orson's backstories. I'd highly recommend giving that a look. The last character I want to mention is Saw Gerrera. He was a character created by George Lucas for the Clone Wars show, which I didn't know before seeing this film. And I like showing a man broken by years of fighting tirelessly against the Empire, to the point where he's become so single-minded that he is labeled an extremist. He is shown to be almost as ruthless as Tarkin and Krennic, and before Andor, I always assumed his inhalation of drugs was primarily a visual allusion to Darth Vader. I really appreciate seeing different factions of the same side all going about the same cause in different ways. The one bit that doesn't work for me is Borgolet. I get that this is another way to demonstrate how he's okay with enacting similar brutish tactics that his enemies would employ in an effort to defeat them, but given that Bodhi snaps back so quickly to lucidity when Cassian begins to talk to him, I feel like there's no real consequences, and thus the initial terrifying possibility of using Borgolet as an extreme means for extracting information loses its punch on repeat viewings. So let's delve into a few more of my issues with the film. I've mentioned the pacing a few times already. The opening 10 minutes are fine, but the subsequent 20 have us jumping around from location to location, trying to introduce all the major players and tie together the individual strands that start the story. It all happens so fast that it's hard to get comfortable with any one scene because by the time we do, we'll be on to the next scene. The movie then settles into an extended sequence on Edu, which fails to engage me. Yes, in lieu of bringing the message back to the Rebel Alliance, which Jyn rather conveniently loses on Jedha, it makes sense to go get Galen, the source of the message. And because Cassian has orders to kill him, it would be nice to tie up these two bits. But A, the constant rain, soaked rocky canyons, and nighttime make for a boring and rather ugly visual palette to me. B, Cassian deciding not to kill Galen comes a little out of nowhere, and while I like how this gives him an arc, the aftermath of this plot point is rather clunky. Jyn calls him out for merely following orders and lying to her, and he in turn calls her out for dismissing his commitment to the rebellion's beliefs and saying he doesn't have to justify his actions, only for their next interaction to be about Cassian feeling guilt for his actions and deciding Jyn's way is the right way. I do like the sentiment and some of the language they both use on the ride back to Yavin, but I feel like I'm missing some connecting tissue to make their next scene really land. Maybe he is won over by Jyn's sterling speech to the Rebel Council, but it feels a little too easy and contrived given that he wasn't swayed by her in the previous scene. C, Chirrut and Baze are distractingly, and dare I say lazily thrown into the action, only helping the mission in token ways. And D, this is a very personal minor gripe, Jyn casually pulling the blaster from a stormtrooper's hands and him slipping into the canyon below is one of the most off-putting and hilariously dumb moments I've seen in this series. And that's saying something considering some of the things we've seen, from Child Leia escaping a band of mercs in a forest, to 3PO's head on top of a battle droid's body, to Rose saving Finn in a way that could have easily killed him. Once the Edu and second Yavin sequences are over, the film shifts into a fantastic action-filled climax on Scarif. But by that point, the film's thematic discussions are virtually done, with the battle featuring only token single-moment ends for each of the characters and their arcs. It feels like the film has lost interest in naturally letting the ideas play out, because that would mean we might intrude on the finale's runtime, which is the reason the movie exists. It's a real bummer because I think with a few more revisions and a willingness to cut back on the action, we could have had a real cohesive think piece instead of a flashy heist film. Given that a lot of cynical folks think of Star Wars as a largely brainless and kid-oriented affair, this would have been a great first step into correcting that assumption. Getting off my high horse for a second, let's discuss the final battle briefly. It's a fantastic sequence of events, with each bit progressing the narrative of the battle rather than existing for its own sake. And I applaud the filmmakers for not copping out and giving at least one of the ground crew a happy ending. It's truly excellent and well worth the price of admission. Another common criticism people bring up is the constant fan service. This is a problem with most Star Wars films, to be fair, but Rogue One is the biggest culprit of so-called member berries this series has. Some of those are fine, like the inclusion of the fighter pilots from Episode 4 via archive footage, and the return of characters like Mon Mothma and Bail Organa. But others, like the Cantina Men, R2 and 3PO, Vader's hallway scene, and the resurrected CGI characters call too much attention to themselves. Not to mention all the little nods like Blue Milk, the Guardians of the Whills, and the T-15 speeder conversation, and it feels like someone got a little too carried away about their excitement making a Star Wars film. It reminds me of the constant homages in Die Another Day. It becomes a game of spotting the references when it really should be focused on telling its story. That said, some of the things do get to me. I can't deny how exciting the Vader hallway scene is to my inner fanboy. Including Tarkin was a great idea, even if I think he should have been recast. But my favorite is the Hammerhead Corvette. Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2 made a powerful impression on me during my childhood, so seeing one of the ships clearly modeled on a key vehicle from those games was wildly exciting. My wife even gave me a weird look in the theater when I reacted to that scene. On the CGI characters, I'm a little split. On the one hand, I appreciate how the effort falls right in line with George's way of thinking about filmmaking, push the boundaries with every project. The idea is certainly not a new one. Forrest Gump, Sky Captain, The Crow, Gladiator, and several TV ads have done this before, but never quite in the same way. Regardless of the morality of the creative choice, it's impressive we've come this far in technology. On the other hand, it has the same problem Lucas's over-reliance on CGI backgrounds and characters suffered from in the prequel trilogy. The technology dates very quickly, and there will always be a sense of unreality to it, the so-called uncanny valley effect. I really wish they had been comfortable with simply recasting the actors and letting a human performance stand, as that will provide you with subtle nuances computers can't replicate. Audiences are quite forgiving when they know an actor has died or is unavailable, and the effort will always be seen as a novelty that exists more for its own sake than enhancing the film. Now that I've exhausted most of my major points, let's wrap up with a few disparate comments. Rogue One was shot by Greg Fraser, who is right up there with Sir Roger Deakins as being one of our best living directors of photography. This movie doesn't quite have the glossy feel of The Force Awakens or the sleekness of The Last Jedi, but there's a grittiness that adds to the used future feel of these films. The color palette is beautifully stark and rich, making for one of my favorite looking films in the franchise. Michael Giacchino should be commended for his work on this score. I always thought he'd be a good replacement in case John Williams couldn't come back, and he proves my faith in him justified, at least as far as replicating the styles of the series. As for content, I feel bad criticizing him at all, given that he had pretty much just 3 or 4 weeks to produce this score. Alexandre Desplat was originally hired, but the complications induced by the altered post-production schedule meant that his other commitments prevented his participation. I do like Giacchino's unique themes for the film, particularly the replacement Imperial motif and Jyn's theme, but I wish this score had more of an acoustic identity apart from the mainline films. Oh well. I don't know if this can be helped, but there are several shots and moments that scream "our heroes are awesome" that take away from the Empire's threat level. For this story to really hit home, the Empire has to feel every bit the monster it is built up to be. And with how casually our heroes kill multiple groups of them, it undermines their strength. You could argue this has been a problem since Episode 4, and I agree with that. But this story would work better if the Empire had teeth, and it does not. In fact, I'm convinced the heroes die only because of sheer force of numbers versus any skill the Imperial troops have. Lastly, the extreme effort shown by the rebels on Scarif and how narrowly Leia avoids capture by Vader in the last 2 minutes adds to Episode 4. Leia really didn't know if throwing the plans in R2 was a good move, but it's all she could think of in the short amount of time she had. So this Hail Mary pass of sending R2 down to Tatooine to find Obi-Wan makes it clear how desperate the rebellion is. This calls back to the initial image of Episode 4 showing us the scale of the Empire versus the rebellion, and I really appreciate the connection. Rogue One has all the trappings to be the best film in the series. However, its story comes across as more of a patchwork of plot points, albeit one with some fantastic thematic coding. The fan service is quite intrusive throughout. Most of the characters, including Jyn, are less fleshed out than they deserve. Basically, the movie chokes on its aspirations. However, the sudden shift to a standout climax makes it easy to forgive a lot of the movie's sins. When we get to the reason the flick exists, it becomes stellar, but you do have to sit through a lot of material before you get to it. With the combined success of The Force Awakens and Rogue One, Lucasfilm boldly moved on to delivering Episode 8, the second part of the sequel trilogy and the film most responsible for renewing the seemingly endless conflict the fandom has been fighting since 1980. But as I'm doing this review series in chronological timeline order, let's move on to an entry that clearly doesn't get enough attention or praise, the one that started it all, a film that is almost universally acclaimed and is a viable contender for the title of the most influential film ever made.